Professor Alistair Finch lived a life of precise order, much like the symphonies he adored. His apartment, nestled on the third floor of an old, grand building, was a sanctuary of hushed tones and scholarly pursuits. Bookshelves groaned under the weight of treatises on counterpoint and harmony. A grand piano, a Steinway that had once belonged to a minor German duke, dominated his living room, its polished surface reflecting the faint light from the street below. Every morning, Alistair, a man whose tailored tweed jacket seemed to have grown from his very skin, would wake at 6 brew Earl Grey tea, and then spend 2 hours at the piano, his gnarled fingers coaxing forth the intricate beauty of Bach or the passionate swells of Brahms. His world was one of classical brilliance, of composers whose names echoed through centuries. Modern music, with its jarring rhythms and simplistic melodies, was an unfortunate noise he mostly managed to ignore. He had taught music theory at the university for 40 years, instilling in generations of students a deep reverence for the masters. He was respected, perhaps even revered, though few dared to breach the quiet solemnity that seemed to constantly surround him. His peace, however, was about to be shattered. The building had seen its share of occupants come and go, mostly quiet professionals or elderly couples. But 2 days ago, a new tenant had moved into the apartment directly below his. Alistair had noted the procession of boxes, the slightly more casual attire of the movers, and had thought little of it. He assumed it would be another silent neighbor, respectful of the building's ancient quiet. He was wrong. It began subtly enough, a low thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards during his morning practice. Alistair frowned, pausing a particularly delicate passage from a Beethoven sonata. He waited. It stopped. He resumed. It started again, louder, this time a repetitive, insistent beat. He sighed, annoyed, and dismissed it as some temporary disturbance. But it wasn't temporary. By the third day, the thrumming had escalated into a full-blown assault on his ears. This morning, right as he was about to embark on the glorious crescendo of a Chopin nocturne, a sound ripped through his carefully constructed piece. It was loud, brash, and utterly devoid of anything he would consider musicality. Thump, 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 followed by a wailing, distorted guitar, and then a voice, a guttural, raw voice that seemed to defy every rule of proper vocal technique. It was crude, primitive, and impossibly loud. Alistair slammed the piano lid shut, the sound echoing harshly in the suddenly suffocating silence of his apartment. He stood trembling, not from anger, but from a profound sense of violation. This was not music, this was noise, pollution, an act of sonic aggression. He walked to his window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain. Below, a moving truck was still parked, though mostly empty now. A young woman, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, with vibrant purple streaks in her otherwise dark hair, was directing 2 burly movers. She wore ripped jeans and a t-shirt featuring some indecipherable band logo. She gestured wildly, her face alight with energy as she laughed, a sound that even from this distance seemed to carry a certain brazenness. It must be her, the perpetrator of this auditory crime. He watched as one of the movers carried in a box marked audio equipment. Alistair felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This was not a temporary inconvenience. This was a direct threat to his entire way of life. The raucous sound below swelled again, the voice practically shaking the very foundations of his antique rug. "Well, I'm a-gonna tell you, honey. I'm a-tellin' you now," the voice howled, accompanied by a frantic drumbeat and a bass line that seemed to mock the very idea of subtlety. Alistair had never been one for confrontation. His preferred method of dealing with unpleasantries was to simply ignore them until they faded away. But this was different. This was an invasion. He felt the deep ancestral need to defend his territory, his sacred space of classical purity. He walked to his desk, picked up the phone, and with a surprisingly steady hand dialed the building manager. "Mr. Henderson," Alistair began, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "I regret to inform you that we have a severe issue with the new tenant in 2B. They are producing an unbearable level of noise." Paused, listening to Mr. Henderson's placating tones. Perhaps the manager would put an end to this madness. He certainly hoped so. He returned to his piano, but the magic was gone. The grand instrument sat silent, no longer a source of joy but a painful reminder of what had been lost. The sound from below, though momentarily quieter still, pulsed like a headache behind his eyes. He tried to read a volume of Mahler's letters, but the words swam before his eyes, replaced by the image of that young woman, her vibrant hair, and the echoes of that primitive, insistent rhythm. This was going to be a problem. A very, very large problem. Alistair Finch, protector of classical purity, had just met his match, and it sang a tune called Jailhouse Rock, and he absolutely, unequivocally hated it, or so he told himself. Deep down, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of something else had been planted. Amidst the outrage, a single insistent guitar riff, strangely complex for such a barbaric tune, had lodged itself in his mind. He tried to dislodge it, but it clung an irritating burr that refused to be shaken off. It was a fragment of the very thing he despised, and yet it stubbornly refused to disappear. It was the first faint whisper of an unwanted curiosity. The following days were a torment. The Jailhouse Rock incident, it turned out, was not an isolated event. The young woman downstairs, Maya, seemed to have an entire repertoire of what Alistair considered sonic sludge. The bass vibrated through his floor, the drums hammered at his eardrums, and the vocals, always raw and untamed, grated on his nerves. He had called Mr. Henderson again and again and again. Each time Mr. Henderson promised to speak to the new tenant. And each time the music would quiet for a brief period, only to erupt anew, sometimes with even greater ferocity. Alistair suspected Maya was either hard of hearing or defiantly ignoring the requests. He was leaning towards defiance. He found himself pacing his apartment, a practice entirely foreign to his usually placid demeanor. He couldn't concentrate on his Bach. His students, usually so receptive to his lectures on counterpoint, found him distracted, his brow perpetually furrowed. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the incessant noise, Alistair decided to take a rare walk in the neighborhood park. He needed fresh air, quiet, anything to cleanse his auditory palate. As he strolled past the ancient oak trees, a familiar, unsettling rhythm began to echo in his mind. It was that particular guitar riff from Jailhouse Rock. It was simple, almost primitive, yet undeniably catchy. He found himself humming it, a low, embarrassed mumble, before snapping himself out of it. What on earth was he doing? He realized with a jolt that his attempts to ignore the music were failing spectacularly. Instead, his mind, accustomed to dissecting complex musical structures, was subconsciously trying to make sense of the chaos. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a puzzle piece that didn't fit but kept demanding his attention. When he returned to his building, the hallway was surprisingly quiet. He took a deep breath, savoring the silence. As he reached his door, he noticed the door to apartment 2B was ajar. A faint but recognizable melody drifted out. It wasn't Jailhouse Rock. This was different. A guitar, yes, but played with a delicate touch, finger-picked, and the melody was surprisingly wistful, almost melancholic. It sounded like a folk song, or perhaps a blues lament. Curiosity, a dangerous emotion for a man so set in his ways, pricked at him. He hesitated, his hand on his doorknob, listening. The music was genuinely beautiful. It had a raw emotion to it that was undeniable. Then the door opened further and Maya stepped out, her arms laden with recycling bags. She nearly bumped into him, stopping short with a gasp. "Oh, Professor Finch, right?" she said, her eyes wide, a flicker of recognition in them. He'd seen her around the university campus before. Though he couldn't place her in any of his classes, she was definitely a student. Alistair, caught off guard, merely nodded, feeling a blush creep up his neck. "Miss Maya Rodriguez," she supplied, a small apologetic smile on her face. "I'm so sorry about the noise, Professor. Moving is crazy, and I guess my speakers are a bit powerful." He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Indeed they are. Shall we say rather able. Particularly Jailhouse Rock. He couldn't resist adding a hint of disdain to his voice. Maya's smile softened, turning, "Oh yeah, Elvis, he's a lot I know, but he's also incredible revolutionary." Alistair scoffed, a sound he instantly regretted. "Revolutionary, my dear Miss Rodriguez? A cacophony of distorted guitars and shouting is hardly revolutionary. Bach was revolutionary. Schoenberg was revolutionary. That is simply noise." Maya didn't back down, her eyes, a striking hazel, met his directly. "With all due respect, Professor, I think you might be missing something. It's not just about the notes. It's about the energy, the feeling, the way it spoke to a whole generation that felt like they were in a jailhouse of their own." She paused, then added almost shyly, "And you know, the musicality is actually pretty complex if you listen for it. The syncopation, the blues scale." Alistair blinked. Syncopation? Blues scale? This young woman was talking about music theory. His music theory. "I teach classical guitar at the conservatory, actually," Maya continued, as if sensing his surprise. "And I am minoring in music history. My professors probably wouldn't approve of my taste in noise." She winked at him. "But I believe all music has something to teach us." Alistair was speechless. He had expected an apology, perhaps a meek promise to turn it down. He had certainly not expected a spirited defense of Jailhouse Rock, delivered with surprising musical insight. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. She wasn't just a noisy neighbor. She was a musician, and she seemed genuinely intelligent, even if her tastes were in his opinion deplorable. "The piece I just heard," he began, a reluctant question forming on his lips. "It was different, less open." Maya's face lit up. "Oh, that was Can't Help Falling in Love. Also Elvis, but a completely different side of him, right? He was so versatile." Alistair frowned. The same artist. He had scoffed at Jailhouse Rock, but that other tune had been undeniably beautiful. This was confusing. It didn't fit his neatly categorized world. "Well," he said, clearing his throat again, I must be going. I have a lecture to prepare." He gestured vaguely towards his door. "Of course, Professor," Maya said, her smile still present. "And again, sorry about the noise. I'll try to keep it down, especially during your piano time." He nodded a curt gesture and retreated into his apartment. Closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, his mind buzzing. Maya Rodriguez, a music student, and she had talked about syncopation and blues scales in relation to Elvis Presley. He walked to his living room, his eyes falling on his silent Steinway. He felt a strange urge not to play but to listen. To that other piece, the one that had been surprisingly lovely, and then perhaps to revisit Jailhouse Rock. Not out of anger, but out of a perverse academic curiosity. He needed to understand how the same artist could produce such wildly disparate sounds. He needed to understand how Miss Rodriguez could possibly call it complex. He scoffed again, more to himself this time. "Nonsense," he muttered, but the word lacked conviction. Tiny crack had appeared in the fortress of his musical prejudice, and threw it a glimmer of unwanted, intriguing light. The next day, Alistair found himself doing something he hadn't done in decades. He visited a modern music store, not a classical sheet music shop, mind you, but a bustling, brightly lit place filled with rows upon rows of compact discs and, to his dismay, piling records, which seemed to be making a perplexing comeback. The air hummed with a low bass beat from the overhead speakers, a sound that made his teeth ache. He felt utterly out of place, a relic among the young people browsing pop albums. He straightened his tweed jacket, feeling a sudden surge of self-consciousness. He approached the counter, where a young man with multiple piercings and a bandy shirt looked up chewing gum. "Can I help you, sir?" the young man asked, his tone surprisingly polite. Alistair cleared his throat. "Yes, I'm looking for recordings by an artist, Elvis Presley. Specifically the song Jailhouse Rock and another piece, Can't Help Falling in Love." He felt a strange embarrassment articulating the names. "Ah, the King. Good choice, sir. We've got a few Elvis compilations. Greatest hits usually have both of those." He gestured to a section, and Alistair followed, feeling like an explorer in an uncharted jungle. He returned home with a CD titled Elvis, The Essential Collection. He stared at the shiny disc, a strange beckett in his classical sanctuary. He didn't even own a CD player, preferring the warmth of vine oak or the direct connection of live performance. But Maya had mentioned digital, so he had bought a small functional player along with the CD. He inserted the disc, his fingers fumbling slightly. He fast-forwarded through several tracks, the unfamiliar sounds assaulting him, until he found Jailhouse Rock. He pressed play. The opening thrum of the bass and the immediate driving drumbeat hit him. This time he was ready. He sat in his armchair, notebook in hand, determined to approach this as an academic exercise. He would dissect it, analyze its flaws, and definitively prove its artistic nullity. He began to scribble notes. Instrumentation, electric guitar, shrill, distorted, bass, overpowering, drums, primitive, repetitive, piano, minimal, percussive, form, simple verse-chorus structure, lax, development, thematic, variations, melody, repetitive, narrow range, largely vocalized, not instrumental, harmony, basic I-Ivory progression, predictable. He listened intently, trying to detach himself from the sheer energy of the track, to focus solely on the theoretical underpinnings. But it was hard. The song had a relentless drive, a raw, almost visceral quality that was difficult to ignore. He focused on the vocal performance. Crude, he wrote. Shouting lacks proper breath control, but effective. No, unrefined. Yet, even as he wrote it, he heard something else. A sneer, a swagger, an attitude that was undeniably part of the music. It wasn't just a voice, it was an instrument of character. Then came that guitar solo, brief, sharp, electrifying. He rewound, played it again. It wasn't technically virtuosic. No Paganini or Segovia, but it was perfectly placed. It punctuated the song, added to its raw energy. He begrudgingly wrote, guitar solo. Simplistic, yet he adds to the rebellious aesthetic. He underlined evil twice, annoyed at himself. He paused the music. He leaned back, his eyes closed. He tried to reconcile his theoretical criticisms with the undeniable feel of the song. It was catchy, annoyingly so. The difference was startling. A gentle, almost lullaby-like melody. The vocals were soft, tender, controlled, a beautiful romantic ballad. Instrumentation. Acoustic guitar, gentle strings, subtle backing. Vocals. He wrote. Melody. Soaring, memorable harmony. Richer, more complex than Jailhouse Rock. He listened to both songs multiple times, switching between them. How could the same artist produce such extremes? It was perplexing. It defied his neat categories. He thought of Maya. She had said, "It's not just about the notes. It's about the energy, the feeling." He had scoffed then, but now he began to see what she meant. Jailhouse Rock was undeniably about energy. It was a force of nature. He found himself humming the guitar riff from Jailhouse Rock, again louder this time. He tried to analyze it. It was based on a simple blues progression, yes, but the way the guitar attacked the notes, the slight bending of the pitch, the raw, almost aggressive tone, it was about rhythmic drive, about attitude. He opened a book on music history, one focused on the early 20th century. He rarely ventured beyond the classical era. He flipped through pages searching for Elvis Presley or rock and roll. He found brief mentions, usually dismissed as a cultural phenomenon rather than a serious musical one. But one sentence caught his eye. the raw energy and rebellious spirit of early rock and roll. Expeply. Milesine altered. By For Alistair, music was an isolated art form, judged purely on its internal mechanics. But perhaps some music was more than just notes on a page. Perhaps it was a reflection of the world, a voice for a generation. He pressed play on Jailhouse Rock. One more time. This time he didn't try to intellectualize it as much. He simply listened. He let the raw, untamed energy wash over him. He still didn't like it. In the way he liked Beethoven, but a seed of grudging respect had been planted. It wasn't just noise, it was a statement, a loud, brash, undeniable statement. It was an insistent, intriguing fragment that had burrowed deep into his analytical mind, demanding further investigation. He realized with a faint tremor of excitement that his initial dismissal had been too quick, too prejudiced. There was something here, something beyond the simple notes, that merited a deeper look. A very reluctant but undeniable intrigue was taking root. Alistair Finch's apartment, once a fortress against modernity, slowly began to transform. The CD player sat proudly on a small table next to his armchair, and the Elvis, the Essential Collection, CD, became a constant companion. He still played his classical pieces, of course, but now his Bach fugues were sometimes followed by the raucous sounds of Hound Dog, or the soulful strains of Love Me Tender. He found himself spending hours dissecting Jailhouse Rock. He downloaded the sheet music online, a new and surprisingly efficient experience, staring at the simple notation, trying to reconcile it with the complex, almost chaotic sound. He focused on the rhythm section. The drums were simple, yes, but the way they drove the song, the insistent offbeat snare hits. It wasn't about complexity. It was about relentless propulsion. And the bass line, it wasn't just root notes. It had a playful, almost jazzy walk to it, locking in perfectly with the drums. He was particularly fixated on the guitar. It wasn't a lead guitar in the traditional sense, but more of a rhythmic textural element, sharp and biting. He listened to the intro again and again, that iconic riff. It was so immediate, so memorable. He realized it wasn't just a string of notes, it was a hook, a primal call to attention. It was engineered for impact, for instant recognition. Then there was the vocal. Alistair, a stickler for classical vocal technique, had initially dismissed it as shouting. But as he listened closer, he heard nuances. The way Elvis slid between notes, the slight rasp in his voice, the sudden bursts of energy, the almost conversational tone at times. It was a performance. It wasn't about technical perfection. It was about raw emotion and charisma. He heard elements of blues and gospel singing, traditions far removed from his operatic comfort zone, but undeniably powerful. He started researching the cultural context of the song. He read about the birth of rock and roll, about the post-war boom, about teenage rebellion, and the desire for something new, something that wasn't their parents' music. He learned about Elvis's background, his humble beginnings, his blend of gospel, blues, and country influences. He began to understand that Elvis wasn't just singing a song. He was embodying a movement. One evening as he was listening, Maya knocked on his door. He opened it, surprised. "Professor?" she asked, a tentative smile on her face. "I just heard all shook up coming from your apartment. Everything. Okay?" There was a hint of amusement in her eyes. Alistair felt a flush of embarrassment. "Ah, yes, Miss Rodriguez. Merely conducting research. An academic exercise." Maya chuckled. "Right, well, I just wanted to see if my speakers were still bothering you. If so, I can try to set them up differently." No, not at all," Alistair said, a little too quickly. "In fact, I've been re-evaluating your observations about the piece. Maya's eyebrows rose. "Really? You're listening to Elvis?" "As I said, Miss Rodriguez, an academic pursuit. he repeated, though his tone was less defensive than before. "I am attempting to understand its popularity, its impact. Well, if you ever want to really understand it, you should watch some of his performances," Maya offered. He wasn't just a singer, he was a performer. The way he moved, the way he connected with the audience, it was electrifying. He was like a lightning bolt. Alistair considered this. He had always viewed music as primarily auditory. The visual aspect of performance was secondary, if at all relevant, but he recalled his own youth, watching footage of celebrated conductors, the way they moved, the energy they radiated. Perhaps there was something to what Maya said. Perhaps, he conceded. "Thank you for the suggestion, Miss Rodriguez." As she walked away, he found himself thinking about her words. He was like a lightning bolt. It was an apt description for Jailhouse Rock. It struck with undeniable force. He returned to his CD player, but instead of the music, he now found himself searching online for videos of Elvis performing Jailhouse Rock. This was an entirely new frontier for Alistair. YouTube removing images on a screen, he typed in the search query, his fingers hesitant. The first result was a black and white video from a film. The screen flickered to life. A young man, impossibly handsome, with dark, slicked-back hair, burst onto the screen. He was singing Jailhouse Rock. But it was so much more than just singing. His body was a blur of motion. His hips gyrated, his legs flexed, his hands moved in sharp, dramatic gestures. He wasn't merely performing, he was embodying the music. He was the syncopation, the rhythm, the raw energy personified. Alistair watched mesmerized. He had never seen anything like it. It was vulgar, certainly by his standards, undignified, yet it was undeniably captivating. The sheer magnetism of the man was palpable, even through the grainy footage. He understood then what Maya meant by energy and feeling. This was not just sound, it was an experience. A full-body, electrifying experience. He saw the faces of the actors in the background, ostensibly fellow prisoners in the scene, and they too were captivated. This wasn't just music to listen to. It was music to feel, to react to. He paused, the video, his mind reeling. His analytical brain, trained for decades to find structure and elegance, was struggling to process this raw, untamed force. He looked at his notes again. Lax development, narrow range, basic harmony, and yet this performance, this man had infused those simple elements with an explosive power that transcended mere notes. He realized his initial assessment had been entirely too narrow. He had judged a storm by the individual raindrops, a volcano by the rocks rather than by the immense, unstoppable force he represented. Elvis Presley wasn't just a song, it was an event. Alistair Finch, the classical purist, felt a strange, almost uncomfortable stirring within him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a young man discovering the revolutionary harmonies of Wagner or the shocking dissonance of Stravinsky. It was the thrill of discovery. The thrill of encountering something utterly new, utterly groundbreaking, something genius. The word blasphemy in his mind just weeks ago now flickered a faint but insistent spark. The days that followed were a whirlwind of internal re-evaluation for Alistair. He consumed every piece of information he could find on Elvis Presley. Biographies, documentaries, concert footage. He learned about his early influences, gospel quartets, blues legends, country crooners, and began to trace the threads of these diverse genres woven into the fabric of his music. He saw how Elvis had taken these disparate elements and fused them into something entirely new, something explosive. He re-listened to Jailhouse Rock dozens of times, no longer as a detached academic critic, but as a student trying to understand. He started to hear the intricate layering he'd missed before. The driving rhythm section acting as a foundation, the biting guitar riffs providing percussive punctuation, the subtle piano accents, and the vocals. He began to appreciate the controlled chaos, The way Elvis used his voice, not just to convey lyrics, but to convey attitude, emotion, and an almost primal energy. The shouting he had scorned now sounded like a powerful declaration. The lack of breath control became a deliberate artistic choice, adding to the raw authenticity. He realized that Elvis's vocal style wasn't about bel canto perfection. It was about expressing a visceral feeling, about connecting directly with the listener's gut. One afternoon, Alistair was particularly engrossed. The sounds of Jailhouse Rock emanating from his CD player at a respectable, but still audible volume. He was leaning over his desk, sketching out the rhythmic interplay between the bass and drums, marveling at its deceptively simple effectiveness. He had a new notebook now separate from his classical studies, dedicated solely to his analysis of rock and roll. Suddenly a knock at the door. He straightened up a little flustered. It was Maya. She stood in his doorway, holding a plate of freshly baked cookies, a warm, inviting smell wafting into his apartment. "Hi, Professor, I made extra, thought you might like some," she offered, her smile bright. Then her eyes darted to his CD player. "Still research?" she teased gently. Alistair felt a familiar blush creep up his neck. "Indeed, deeply immersed. I'm afraid." He gestured vaguely at his desk. "Come in, Miss Strawglazed. These smell delightful." She stepped inside, placing the plate on a small side table. Her gaze fell on his open notebook, filled with his scribbled musical notations, diagrams, and observations. Her eyes widened slightly as she saw Jailhouse Rock written in his precise hand, followed by a series of notes like blues influence, syncopated drive, and vocal charisma. Raw, powerful. "You're really getting into it, aren't you?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine surprise and pleasure. Alistair cleared his throat. "I am discovering complexities I had previously overlooked." Maya narrow-minded. He picked up a cookie, taking a bite. "Delicious, by the way," Maya laughed. "A bright, clear sound." "Thanks. My grandmother's recipe." She paused, then pointed to one of his notes. "Vocal charisma. Raw, powerful. That's exactly it." He wasn't just singing notes. He was singing life. He was singing what it felt like to be young and rebellious in a world that wanted you to conform. Alistair nodded slowly. "I'd been studying the cultural impact as well. It's fascinating how a piece of music can become so intertwined with a societal shift." "Exactly," Maya exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. "It's not just a song. It's a statement, and the way he delivered it, the way he moved, it was groundbreaking. It broke all the rules, but in a way that just worked." Indeed, Alistair mused, walking towards his CD player. "The harmonic simplicity, which I initially dismissed as primitive, is actually its strength. It provides a raucous foundation for the rhythmic and vocal firework. And the Connor, we recognition. You really mean that, Professor? You think Jailhouse Rock is a masterclass?" Alistair turned to her, his expression serious. "Miss Rodriguez, I believe I have been profoundly mistaken in my assessment. I allowed my prejudice to blind me to the artistic merit within this genre. What Elvis Presley achieved. Poor, tammi postre as quo. It was a revolupivular intuition HDSD." He took a deep breath, then continued, a strange mix of awe and intellectual excitement in his voice. He took the raw power of the blues, the spiritual fervor of gospel, the storytelling simplicity of country, and he forged them into something entirely new. And he presented it with a stage presence that was utterly unprecedented. He looked directly at Maya, his eyes shining with a newfound realization. "Miss Rodriguez, I believe Elvis Presley was a genius." The words hung in the air, weighty and unexpected. Maya stared at him, her smile slowly widening into a look of genuine astonishment and delight. It was a rare moment of pure, unadulterated intellectual honesty from a man who had seemed perpetually shrouded in the past. "Wow," Maya breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Professor Finch. That's incredible. I mean, I always believed it. But to hear you say it," she shook her head, a happy laugh bubbling up. That's amazing." Alistair felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. Admitting his mistake, embracing this new understanding felt like shedding a heavy cloak. He was no longer just a classical purist. He was a musician open to the vast, diverse world of sound. "It is," Alistair agreed, a small triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Truly is, and I suspect, Miss Rodriguez, that I have only just scratched the surface." He looked at the CD player, then at his new notebook, then back at Maya, whose eyes sparkled with shared understanding. The ice was broken, and in its place, a bridge was forming, built on the unlikely foundation of Jailhouse Rock. The declaration hung in the air, a revolutionary pronouncement in the hallowed halls of Alistair Finch's apartment. Elvis Presley was a genius. He had said it, and saying it aloud to someone else made it real, concrete. He saw the genuine awe and delight on Maya's face, and it reinforced his own conviction. After Maya left, Alistair sat in his armchair, a profound sense of exhilaration washing over him. It wasn't just about Elvis or Jailhouse Rock anymore. It was about his own intellectual liberation. He had spent decades in a finely constructed musical box, and now a corner of it had been blown open by a raw, rhythmic force. He returned to his analysis, but this time with a new lens. He wasn't looking for flaws to discredit. He was looking for brilliance to understand. He pulled out his copy of Structure and Form in Western Music by Feat's book he had practically memorized. He then placed it next to the sheet music for Jailhouse Rock. He wanted to see how the primitive form of the song, the simple verse-chorus, actually worked. He realized the genius was in its efficiency. Every element served a purpose. Intro guitar riff immediately grabbed attention, setting the tone. The verses told a story, simple but vivid. Chorus was an explosive release, a collective shout of defiance. There were no wasted notes, no extraneous flourishes. It was lean, mean, and utterly effective. He thought about counterpoint, the intricate interplay of multiple melodic lines, a hallmark of Bach. Jailhouse Rock didn't have melodic counterpoint in the classical sense, but it had a different kind, the rhythmic interplay between the bass, drums, and guitar. Each instrument had its own distinct rhythmic pattern, yet they interlocked perfectly, creating a driving, irresistible groove. It was a percussive counterpoint, a rhythmic dance. Then there was the blues scale, which Maya had mentioned. He studied its structure, its inherent tension and release. He saw how Elvis wove it into his vocal lines, bending notes, adding a soulful, almost mournful quality even to an upbeat song. This was not random. It was deeply rooted in a rich musical tradition, but adapted electrifyingly. For a new audience, he considered the performance aspect. Alistair, the man who believed music was solely for the ears, now understood the dropping power of the visual. Elvis's movements were not merely choreography. They were an extension of the music itself. The hip swivels, the leg shakes, the raw energy. It was all part of the composition. It was a total artistic experience, combining sound, movement, and persona into a singular, unforgettable expression. He realized that Jailhouse Rock wasn't just a song about being in a jailhouse. It was a metaphor for breaking free, for expressing oneself without constraint. And Elvis, through his music and his electrifying presence, gave voice to that liberation. Alistair thought about the great classical composers he admired. Beethoven breaking the mold with his symphonies, pushing boundaries. Stravinsky shocking the world with the rhythmic savagery of The Rite of Spring. They were all revolutionaries in their own time, taking existing forms and twisting them, transforming them into something new and efful. Elvis, he now understood, was no different. He took the folk traditions of America, blues, gospel, country, and amplified them, electrified them, imbued them with a defiant youthfulness, and unleashed them upon the world. He didn't invent music, but he reinvented its delivery, its message, its raw power. He wasn't just a singer. He was an innovator, an iconoclast, a cultural force. The word genius no longer felt like a scandalous thought. It felt like the only accurate description. Alistair got up and walked to his grand piano. He sat down, not to play Bach, but to try and translate Jailhouse Rock to the keys. He tried to replicate that driving bass line with his left hand, the sharp percussive guitar riffs with his right, tried to capture the rhythmic energy, the syncopation, the bluesy inflections. It was surprisingly difficult. The simplicity was deceptive. The precise timing and attack were crucial. Played the intro riff, then the main chords, trying to imbue them with the same raw energy he heard on the record. He began to hum the vocal line, experimenting with the inflections, the slides, the almost guttural cries. He found himself swaying slightly on the piano bench, a subtle movement that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. A smile, wide and genuine, spread across his face. He felt like a young man again, full of discovery, full of the boundless joy of music. He felt a connection to something vital and alive, something he had deliberately shut out for too long. His mind began to buzz with ideas. How could he convey this newfound understanding to his students? How could he show them the brilliance he had discovered? He couldn't just tell them Elvis was a genius. He had to show them why. He had to dissect it with the same rigor he applied to a Beethoven sonata, but with a new openness, a new appreciation for different forms of musical brilliance. He imagined the looks on his colleagues' faces, their raised eyebrows, their quiet disdain. He didn't care. He had found something profound, something truly revolutionary, and he was ready to share it. The sanctuary of his apartment was no longer just a place of classical study. It had become a vibrant laboratory where different forms of musical genius could meet, clash, and ultimately find harmony. The transformation was not just intellectual. It was deeply personal, heartwarming. In its rediscovery of joy and passion, Professor Alistair Finch's classroom had always been a bastion of classical tradition. Lectures on Baroque counterpoint, romantic harmony, and 20th century tonality filled the air. But in the weeks following his genius revelation, a subtle shift began. He still taught the curriculum with his usual precision, but there was a new glint in his eye, a barely perceptible spring in his step. His examples, usually drawn from Bach or Mozart, sometimes now included a passing, almost casual reference to a rhythmic drive, reminiscent of certain mid-20th century popular forms, or a melodic hook, much like those found in Well, You Understand. His students, accustomed to his staid pronouncements, noticed they exchanged puzzled glances. Was Professor Finch changing? One afternoon, during a break in his music history, the third lecture, Alistair saw Maya in the hallway. She looked up, beaming. "Professor, heard you played Heartbreak Hotel on the piano this morning." Sounded soulful. Alistair chuckled. "Ah yes, Miss Rodriguez. Merely exploring the blues progression. Its elegant simplicity is quite remarkable, you know." Maya laughed outright. "Who knew you had it in you, Professor?" "It appears there is more to music than the symphony hall, a realization I am perhaps belatedly embracing." Their conversations became more frequent, blossoming into genuine discussions about music. Maya would talk about contemporary artists, electronic music, the evolution of... Alistair would listen, genuinely curious, and then draw parallels to classical forms. He found himself explaining the influence of improvisation in jazz by comparing it to the cadenzas in classical concertos. He discussed the emotional depth of a folk ballad and compared it to a Schubert Lied. He learned that Maya was struggling with her own musical identity. She loved classical guitar, but also felt drawn to the raw energy of rock and the intricate rhythms of modern R&B. She worried that pursuing modern music would betray her classical training, that her professors would view it as a lesser art form. "But Miss Rodriguez," Alistair argued one day, "true artistry transcends genre. What matters is the craft, the emotion. The connection: Bach found inspiration in folk dances, Beethoven pushed the boundaries. Revolutionaries, not unlike your Elvis Presley. Maya looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. You really think so? I do, Alistair said firmly. Your classical training provides you with a formidable foundation, a deep understanding of musical architecture. Imagine applying that knowledge, that discipline, to the creation of new forms, new expression. He saw the worry lift from her face, replaced by a spark of inspiration. Their connection deepened, no longer just a professor and a student, but two musicians, finding common ground across generations. Alistair, for his part, found himself listening to music differently. He began to hear rock songs, not just as noise, but as intricate structures of rhythm, harmony, and melody, albeit with different rules than those he was used to. He started to recognize the genius in a catchy pop hook, the complexity in a deceptively simple guitar riff, the emotional power in a raw vocal delivery. He even started to pay attention to the music playing in the university cafeteria, something he would have considered beneath him before. He heard the influences, the echoes of blues, gospel, jazz, even classical, woven into the modern tapestry. One morning, his colleague, Professor Davies, a staid musicologist known for his dry wit, approached him. Alistair, old friend, I must ask, are my ears deceiving me? Or did I hear blue suede shoes wafting from your office this morning? Alistair smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that surprised Davies. Indeed, Arthur. I've been conducting some rather illuminating research in quite deity. Never better, Arthur, Alistair replied, a twinkle in his eye. I've simply come to the rather astonishing conclusion that dismissing an entire genre based on preconceived notions is, in fact, quite unscholarly and, frankly, a disservice to the remarkable talent within it. Davies merely shook his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Well, I suppose it's never too late to broaden one's horizons, even for an old dog like you, Alistair. He walked away, still shaking his head, but Alistair sensed a flicker of intrigue in his colleague's eyes. Alistair returned to his office, a profound sense of peace settling over him. His world felt bigger, richer, more vibrant. He wasn't abandoning his love for classical music, he was expanding it. He was discovering that the well of human musical expression was far deeper and more diverse than he had ever imagined. He sat at his desk, and instead of pulling out a dusty score, he opened his laptop and searched for a new Elvis song he hadn't fully explored yet. His fingers, once gnarled only by the demands of Bach, now tapped out a rhythm on the desk, a silent testament to the new beat in his own heart. The world of music had opened up, and Alistair Finch was ready to explore every single note of it. The thought of publicly declaring Elvis Presley a genius, especially within the hallowed halls of the university's music department, filled Alistair Finch with a familiar mix of dread and exhilaration. It was akin to a scientist announcing a groundbreaking theory that overturned decades of established thought. He knew he would face skepticism, even ridicule. But the conviction burned within him, a flame ignited by his recent discoveries. He decided to approach it methodically, just as he would any complex piece of research. He would prepare a lecture, meticulously outlining his arguments, using the very tools of classical music theory to dissect and illuminate the genius of rock and roll. He would present his findings at the annual Musicology Symposium, an event usually dedicated to obscure Renaissance composers or the intricacies of 19th century opera. He spent weeks holed up in his study working with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. His desk, usually neatly organized, became a controlled chaos of classical scores, rock and roll albums, biographical texts, and hastily scribbled notes. He charted chord progressions, analyzed rhythmic patterns, transcribed vocal inflections, and even drew rudimentary diagrams of Elvis's stage movements, Maya became his sounding board. He would invite her up for tea, and instead of discussing her classical guitar lessons, he would excitedly expound on his latest revelation about a particular Elvis song. The way he uses the call and response in "Hound Dog, Miss Rodriguez," he'd explain, tapping his finger on a note. It's directly from the gospel tradition, but amplified, given a secular, almost defiant edge. It's brilliant in its adaptation. Maya would listen, offering her own insights from a more contemporary perspective. And the way he builds tension, Professor, before the chorus kicks in, it's like a classical crescendo, but with a different kind of release, more explosive. She encouraged him every step of the way. Professor, you have to do this. No one else has your knowledge of classical theory, combined with, well, your new understanding of rock. You can explain it in a way that others might actually listen. But the resistance, Miss Rodriguez? Alistair sighed, rubbing his temples. Professor Davies will likely scoff. Young Dr. Chen will accuse me of abandoning scholarly rigor. Let them scoff, Maya declared, her eyes bright. Truth is truth, Professor, and besides, imagine how many students like me are stuck between these two worlds. You could open their minds, show them that music isn't just one thing. It's everything. Her words resonated deeply. It wasn't just about proving Elvis's genius. It was about broadening the definition of music itself, about building bridges between genres, between generations. He titled his lecture, "The King and the Canon." Elvis Presley as a revolutionary figure in 20th century music. He knew the title alone would raise eyebrows. He prepared slides contrasting complex classical scores with the deceptively simple notation of Jailhouse Rock, then showing how the performance elevated the latter to an entirely different level of artistic expression. He planned to play excerpts, not just of Elvis, but of the blues and gospel artists who influenced him, demonstrating the lineage, the evolution. He would show clips of Elvis's performances, highlighting the physicality, the charisma, the undeniable connection he forged with his audience. He knew he would have to be meticulous, precise, and irrefutable. He couldn't rely on mere opinion. He had to use the very language of music theory, his language, to make his case. The day before the symposium, Alistair felt a nervous flutter in his stomach, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his doctoral defense. He ran through his lecture one last time, pacing his living room. He practiced his opening lines, his voice firm and unwavering. He paused before his grand piano. He had come full circle. From despising the noise below, to grudgingly listening, to intensely analyzing, to now championing a figure he once deemed unworthy. It was a remarkable journey. He thought of the hundreds of students he had taught, the thousands of hours he had spent in his sanctuary, immersing himself in the timeless beauty of classical music. He still loved it, perhaps even more so now, because he understood it was but one star in a vast glittering cosmos of sound. He looked at his CD player, then at his meticulous notes. He had the evidence, he had the conviction, he had the passion. He closed his eyes. And for a moment he heard not just the driving beat of Jailhouse Rock, but the soaring melodies of a Bach concerto, the raw power of a blues lament, and the pure, unadulterated joy of a gospel choir, all woven together, all part of the glorious tapestry of music. He smiled. He was ready. This wasn't just a lecture, testament to the power of music, to surprise, to challenge, and ultimately to unite. And he, Alistair Finch, the once unyielding classical purist, was about to share his revelation with the world, or at least with the slightly less wide world, of the university's music department. The Musicology Symposium was held in the university's largest lecture hall, a grand room usually filled with the hushed reverence appropriate for academic discourse. Today, however, there was a palpable buzz. Whispers circulated about Professor Finch's eccentric choice of topics. Colleagues exchanged amused glances. Students, especially those in Maya's cohort, buzzed with anticipation. Alistair walked to the podium, his tweed jacket pressed, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked every inch the distinguished classical scholar. Placed his meticulously prepared notes on the stand, adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. "Good morning, esteemed colleagues and students," he began, his voice calm and clear, though a tremor of excitement ran beneath his composure. "My presentation today is titled, 'The King and the Canon, Elvis Presley as a Revolutionary Figure in 20th Century Music.'" A ripple went through the audience. A few chuckles could be heard. Professor met their gazes unflinchingly. "I understand that some of you may find my topic unorthodox," Alistair continued, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Indeed, for many years I myself would have dismissed such a notion as utterly preposterous. However, through rigorous academic inquiry, and I might add a rather profound Persian," pressed a button, and the iconic biting guitar riff of Jailhouse Rock filled the lecture hall. It was loud, raw, and utterly out of place. Some audience members visibly flinched, but Alistair let it play for a full 30 seconds. Letting the raw energy wash over the room when the music faded, he began. "This, as many of you know, is Jailhouse Rock. Performed by Elvis Presley, my initial reaction to this piece was one of profound distaste, even revulsion. I perceived it as crude, simplistic. I now realize, tragically mistaken. Proceeded to dissect the song, not just as a cultural phenomenon, but as a musical composition. Put up a slide comparing the simple ABAB structure of Jailhouse Rock to the classical sonata form, showing how both achieve their effect through tension and release, albeit with different means. He discussed the blues scale in Presley's vocals, drawing parallels to the expressive chromaticism in romantic opera. He displayed sheet music, highlighting the syncopated rhythms of the bass and drums, demonstrating how they created a powerful forward momentum. "This is not accidental," he asserted, pointing to specific notes. "This is a deliberate, highly effective use of rhythmic displacement, creating an irresistible groove. It compels the listener to engage physically and emotionally." He then played video clips. First, a grainy recording of an early blues artist. Then a gospel choir, demonstrating the clear lineage of Presley's vocal style and stage presence. Finally, he showed the Jailhouse Rock film performance. As Elvis gyrated across the screen, the initial murmurs in the audience faded into silence. They watched, transfixed, as Alistair meticulously pointed out. Details observe the connection with the audience, even a filmed one. The sheer magnetism. This is not merely a singer. This is a performer utilizing every aspect of his being to convey the song's message. His vocal delivery, Alistair continued, while eschewing classical purity, possesses an unparatesity. He wasn't just singing notes. He was singing a cultural statement, the sneer, the swagger, the vulnerability. These were all deliberate components of his artistry. He was a force of nature. He was by any measure a genius. A profound silence filled the room, then a single clap, then another. And then a wave of applause, building into a standing ovation. Alistair looked out at the audience, a lump forming in his throat. He saw students, their faces alight with understanding and excitement. He saw some colleagues, their initial skepticism replaced by thoughtful nods. And in the front row, Maya was beaming, her eyes shining with pride. Professor Davies approached him after the lecture, a strange look on his face. "Alistair," he said, shaking his head slowly, "I must admit I came expecting a farce, but you presented a most compelling argument. I may need to revisit my record collection." A genuine smile, something Alistair rarely saw from Davies, spread across his colleague's face. Young Dr. Chen, usually reserved, came up to him. "Professor Finch, that was revelatory. I confess I'd never considered popular music with such academic rigor. You've truly opened my eyes." Alistair felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't just acceptance, it was understanding. He had not only defended a musical giant, but had also shown his peers and students that the world of music was far vaster and more interconnected. The classical purist had, in fact, become a bridge builder. The symposium was a turning point. Professor Alistair Finch found himself a minor celebrity within the university, particularly among the students. His classes, once attended by diligent but often subdued classical purists, now buzzed with a new kind of energy. Students from other departments, drawn by the whispers of the rock and roll professor, began to audit his lectures. He started incorporating examples from popular music into his teaching, not just for Elvis, but for other artists as well. He would compare the harmonic complexity of a Beatles song to a Bach chorale, or analyze the rhythmic sophistication of a contemporary jazz piece alongside a Stravinsky ballet. His students found these connections thrilling, bridging the gap between the music they grew up with and the foundational principles of music. Theory Maya's passion for her own music blossomed. With Alistair's encouragement, she began composing pieces that blended her classical guitar training with the bluesy riffs and powerful vocals inspired by rock and roll. She no longer felt she had to choose between genres. She could synthesize them, create something entirely new. Alistair became her informal mentor, offering guidance on composition, form, and emotional expression, his ear now finely tuned to the nuances of all genres. Their bond deepened. Maya often brought him freshly baked goods, and Alistair in turn would invite her to private recitals where he would, to her delight, play an unexpected, beautifully rendered piano arrangement of an Elvis tune subtly interwoven with classical flourishes. One sunny afternoon, Alistair and Maya sat on a bench in the campus garden. The gentle murmur of student life around them. Alistair was explaining the concept of thematic development, using both a Beethoven symphony and a classic rock album as examples. "You know," Professor Maya said, "before you, I always felt like my love for rock and pop was something I had to hide from my classical teachers, like it was a guilty pleasure or something lesser." Alistair nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "And I, for my part, believed that anything outside the established canon was simply noise. We were both, in our own ways, trapped by our preconceptions." He paused, looking at the vibrant flowers. "But music, true music, transcends labels. It is a universal language expressed in myriad dialects." "You really showed me that," Maya said softly. "You showed me that a genius can emerge anywhere from any background, and that the same principles of beauty and craft can apply no matter the instruments or the style." Alistair smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "And you, Miss Rodriguez, showed me the importance of listening with an open mind. You reminded me that sometimes the most profound revelations come from the most unexpected places, from a loud, rebellious song played by a young woman with purple hair, for instance." Maya laughed, a joyful sound. "It certainly gave me a good jolt, literally and figuratively." He felt a profound sense of contentment. His life, once so orderly and predictable, was now richer, more vibrant, filled with new sounds and new connections. He hadn't abandoned his love for classical music, he had simply expanded his appreciation for music in all its forms. His work felt more meaningful, his connection to his students more genuine. He had found a new purpose, not just as a guardian of tradition, but as a bridge builder, a guide for a new generation of musicians. A few months later, at the university's end-of-year concert, Maya performed a new composition for classical guitar and electric bass. It was a stunning piece, weaving intricate classical melodies with bluesy improvisations and a driving rock rhythm. It was fresh, innovative, and undeniably brilliant. The audience, a mix of classical aficionados and younger students, gave her a roaring standing ovation. Alistair sat in the front row, his heart swelling with pride. As Maya took her bows, her eyes met his, and he saw a silent message of gratitude and shared joy. He knew then that his journey with Jailhouse Rock was not just about Elvis. It was about the enduring power of music to connect, to inspire, and to transform. It was a story of opening one's mind, of finding genius in unexpected places, and of the heartwarming harmony that could emerge when different worlds finally found a way to dance together. His legacy, he realized, would not just be in the preservation of the past, but in the cultivation of the future. A future where all music in all its forms was celebrated for its genius.